Her father's hands were rough and warm. She was 7, sitting under an overturned iron plate while sleet ticked on the metal above them. He took her wrist and pressed her palm against the iron. She felt heat moving into her skin, steady and deep, held there by the cook fire beneath. Then he moved her hand to a plank wall where a seam gaped. The warmth vanished. The wind pulled it out of the air faster than the fire could replace it. She would not understand why he had taught her that until the October she was told to survive a Dakota winter alone at 13 with nothing but river wreckage and the memory of where heat goes when the wind finds it. The settlement had no name anyone agreed on. Some called it Moen's Landing after the deacon who filed first. Others called it the Bluff, which was at least honest. It sat above the Missouri River in Dakota Territory, a clutch of 8 households strung along a wagon trace that turned to grease in rain and iron in frost. The year was 1880, and October had come early with a wind that tasted of things dying. Ragna Brecka was 13 years old the morning her mother stopped breathing. She had watched it happen by degrees. The cough had started in late August, a dry sound like a hinge that needed oil. By September, it was wet. By the first week of October, Ragna's mother could not cross the room without sitting on the floor with her mouth open, pulling air that did not seem to reach her lungs. The lean-to they shared behind Marit Vangen's cabin smelled of tallow, sweat, and something sharper underneath, something Ragna did not have a word for, but recognized the way an animal recognizes smoke. She had boiled willow bark. She had kept the blankets dry. She had borrowed a tin of lard from Marit and rubbed it on her mother's chest the way her father once rubbed grease on a stiff joint. None of it mattered. The fever took what it wanted and left the rest. Her mother died on a Tuesday. Ragna knew it was Tuesday because she had been counting days since the last supply cart, and the cart came on Saturdays, and 4 days had passed. She sat beside the body for an hour without moving. Then she pulled the quilt up over her mother's face, walked outside, and told Marit Vangen in a voice that did not shake. Marit closed her eyes. She did not say she was sorry. She said, "I will send for Peter." That name carried weight in the settlement the way a millstone carries weight. Peter Moen was 58 years old, built like a man who had spent 40 years lifting things other men could not lift, and he served as deacon, arbiter, and unofficial magistrate for every household on the bluff. He had built the best chinked cabin within 2 days' ride. His walls did not leak, his stores did not run short, his opinions did not bend. He arrived within the hour, which meant he had already been thinking about this. Ragna stood outside the lean-to with her hands at her sides. She had washed her face in cold water from the barrel. She had braided her hair. She understood, without anyone explaining it, that the next half hour would decide whether she lived through winter or did not. Peter did not look at the body first. He looked at Ragna. He studied her the way a man studies a beam before deciding whether it can bear load. Then he ducked into the lean-to, spent 2 minutes inside, and came back out with his jaw set. "Lung fever," he said. Not to Ragna, to Marit, who stood 6 paces back with her arms crossed against the cold. "I know what it was," Marit said. "Then you know it sits in walls. It sits in bedding. It sits in a room where a person coughed for 6 weeks. Peter pulled his coat tighter. "This lean-to needs to be burned or left open to freeze through. Either way, no one sleeps here again this season." Ragna felt the ground shift under her feet. Not the physical ground. The other kind. The kind that holds a person's place in the world. "She can stay with me," Marit said. But she said it the way a person says something they know will be refused. She said it to be recorded, not to be acted upon. Peter shook his head. "You have 4 children and a cord and a half of wood. You told me yourself last Sunday you are short. Every house on this bluff is short." He turned to Ragna for the first time and spoke to her directly, which was worse than being ignored, because it meant he considered her old enough to hear the math. "No house in this settlement has wood enough for charity. Not this year." The wind came off the river and flattened the dead grass along the bluff edge. Somewhere below, ice groaned against the bank. "There is the landing," Pater said. Marit's face changed. "The landing is not a place for a child. The landing has a partial roof. It has salvaged timber. It has the wreck debris." Pater pulled a folded paper from inside his coat. Ragna saw the church seal on it, pressed in wax that had cracked in the cold. "The elders met on this yesterday. Before her mother passed, we knew it was coming." That was the sentence that cut deepest. They had planned this while her mother was still alive. They had written the paper while Ragna was boiling willow bark and believing effort could change something. Pater held the paper out, not to Ragna. To Marit's youngest daughter, Christy, a girl of 9 who had been standing by the woodpile watching everything with eyes that understood more than her age should have allowed. Christy took the paper and looked at it, and then looked at Ragna, and did not move. "Give it to her," Pater said. Christy walked the paper across the frozen mud and held it up. Ragna took it. The wax seal snapped in the wind like dry bark. The paper said what papers like this always said. By decision of the Elder Council, the minor child Ragna Brecka was released from communal obligation and assigned the lower landing and associated salvage rights, effective upon the death or departure of her remaining parent. Released. As if she had been held and was now free. As if freedom and exile were the same word. 2 boys Ragna did not know well. Marit's nephews, she thought, carried her flour sack and bedroll down the bluff path as if moving a dead person's effects. They did not speak to her. They set the bundle beside a collapsed freight platform, where the mud had frozen into ridges, and walked back up without looking behind them. Ragna stood alone at the landing, with $11 in mixed coin and scrip sewn into her hem, a flour sack that held perhaps 10 pounds of meal, a kettle with a cracked handle, 2 wool blankets that smelled of her mother, and a hatchet with a split in the haft. The river made dull sounds beneath the shore ice. The wind had no opinion about her survival. She had no team, no wagon, no saw, no male relative whose name could open a door. She had no cut wood at all. The settlement's conventional wisdom, the wisdom Pater had built his authority upon, held that a household needed a tight cabin, months of preparation, and a steady supply chain to survive a Dakota winter. Ragna had none of these things. She had a flour sack and $11, and the knowledge that the bluff road above her would be impassable by deep November. She counted what she could see. The landing had old timbers, gray and split, broken decking planks with nails still in them, bent iron straps, barrel hoops rusting in coils, 2 cracked shipping crates with the stencils worn to shadows, and downslope, near the frozen mud where the bank met the water. Something else. A shape. Black iron, half buried, crusted with silt and river mud. Cylindrical, massive. The remains of a boiler shell from a wrecked Missouri River steamer, left behind when the boat was stripped or abandoned. The rivets still showed along its seams like stitches on a wound. The furnace opening gaped at one end, large enough for a person to crawl through. The far end was partially collapsed or buried. Rust had painted everything the color of old blood. To any adult on the bluff, it was scrap. River junk. The skeleton of a dead machine that the water had refused to keep. Ragna looked at it for a long time. The wind hit her face and passed around the cylinder and kept going. She noticed that. The wind hit her, and the wind hit the iron, and the iron did not move, and the wind went somewhere else. She noticed that. Night came fast in October on the Missouri. By 5 the light was gray. By 6 it was gone. Ragna did not sleep in the boiler shell that first night. She was not ready for that, and she was not stupid enough to crawl into an unknown space in the dark. Instead, she dragged planks against the leeward side of a collapsed freight frame and hung one blanket as a windbreak and pulled the other over herself and lay on frozen ground and shook until her muscles ached from shaking. The wind came through every gap, through the plank joints, through the blanket weave. through the seams of her coat and the threads of her stockings and the spaces between her fingers. She pressed her body against the freight frame and felt the cold come through the wood as if the wood were not there. That was when the memory surfaced. Not a thought, a sensation. She was 7 years old, sitting under an overturned iron skiff plate while sleet rattled on the metal above. Her father's hands were rough and warm. He took her wrist gently, the way he did everything with her, and pressed her palm against the iron. The metal held warmth from the cook fire they had built beneath it. She felt heat moving into her hand, steady and deep. Then he moved her palm to a plank wall where a seam gaped. The wind came through the seam like a needle. The cold was not just cold, it was motion. It was theft. The wind was taking warmth out of the air faster than the fire could put it back. Her father had said something then. She could not remember the exact words. But the meaning had stayed in her body the way a burn stays. The thing that kills you in winter is not the absence of heat. It is the presence of wind. A fire means nothing if the wind owns the room. Halvor Brekke had worked around river machinery. He had loaded freight and repaired deck fittings and once spent a season as a boiler hand's assistant on a sternwheeler running between Yankton and Fort Pierre. He had died 2 summers ago when a steam fitting burst and the scalding took his chest and arms. He had lived 3 days after that, long enough to make Ragna promise she would take care of her mother, which she had done, and long enough to make her understand that iron and fire and pressure were things that could save you or kill you, depending on whether you understood them. She understood one thing her father had taught with his hands instead of his words. Curved iron stops wind, packed earth stops drafts. A small space holds heat better than a large one, and the boiler shell sitting in the mud below the landing was all 3 of those things at once. By dawn, she was moving. The boiler shell was worse than it looked from the bluff, and it had not looked good. Ragna circled it twice in the gray morning light, stamping her feet against the cold, cataloging damage the way her father would have. The main cylinder was intact along the upper curve. The rivets held. The iron was thick. She rapped it with the hatchet butt and heard a dull sound, not a ring, which meant density, not fracture. The lower half was buried in silt and frozen mud. The furnace opening at one end was roughly 3 feet across, large enough to crawl through on hands and knees, and the area around it showed the remnants of what her father would have called the firebox, the chamber where fuel burned to heat the water above. The ashpan brackets were still bolted in place. At the far end she could see where the flue path had run, now packed solid with river sediment and debris. Inside, the shell was dark and stank of mud, rust, and something organic that she did not want to identify. Silt had built up in the lower areas, especially where the mud drum, the low collection point for sediment in river boilers, had once sat. The sediment was dense, cold, and slick. Water had pooled and frozen in the lowest spots. But she stood inside the cylinder and held still. The wind outside was moving at a pace that had kept her awake all night, that had driven cold through every plank and blanket she owned. Inside the shell, she felt nothing. The air was still. Dead still. Cold, yes. Miserable, yes. But still. No draft. She pressed her hand against the iron wall. It was cold to the touch. Iron conducted cold as readily as it conducted heat, and she knew that. Her father had burned his hands on iron and frozen his hands on iron and explained both. But the curve of the wall meant the wind passed around instead of through. There were no seams, no cracks, no chinking gaps. The shell was one continuous surface of riveted iron plate, and the wind could not find a way inside. Ragna crouched in the dark and did the math that Peter Moen had done on the bluff, except she did it differently. Peter had counted what she lacked. No cabin, no team, no fuel supply, no labor. He was right about all of it. She could not build a house. She could not cut enough wood to feed a house-sized fire through 5 months of winter. She could not chink walls she did not have, or hang a door on a frame that did not exist. But she did not need a house. She needed a space the wind could not enter. She needed this. The shell was roughly 12 feet long and perhaps 4 feet across at its widest interior point. She measured with her arm span, the way her father had measured deck fittings. If she cleared the silt, dried the interior, raised a sleeping platform above the coldest floor, and banked the outside with mud and straw to cut any residual draft at the base, she would have a space small enough to heat with a modest fire. The furnace opening was her door, and her firebox at once. If she built a proper fire footing at that end and created even a crude vent at the other, she could draw heat along the length of the cylinder without sleeping in smoke. Not a house, not a cabin, not anything Peter Moen would recognize as a structure worth the name. A windproof heated shell, a place the Dakota winter could not reach. She said it out loud to no one. I can live in this. The words sounded thin in the iron dark. She was not sure she believed them, but she was sure of the alternative, which was freezing to death in a plank lean-to while the settlement above her counted the days until they could stop feeling guilty. She started scraping sludge with a bent spoon she had found in the wreckage. Marit van Gen came down the bluff path 2 days later, carrying a heel of dark bread and a look that Ragna had seen on the faces of women visiting the sick, kind, and already grieving. You are living in it, Marit said. Not a question. She stood at the furnace opening and looked inside the way a person looks into a well, with distance, with the expectation of something unpleasant at the bottom. Ragna had been scraping for 2 days. Her hands were raw. The fingernails on her right hand were cracked from prying frozen sediment off the interior walls, and rust had gotten into the cracks, staining her skin an orange-brown that would not wash clean. She had cleared perhaps 1/3 of the interior silt, piling it outside in a mound she planned to use later for banking. The work was brutal and slow, and every time she stopped to rest, the cold reminded her why she could not stop. I am cleaning it, Ragna said. Living in it comes after. Marit stepped closer and put her hand on the iron wall. She pulled it back as if bitten. Iron sweats in cold. You know this. When warm air meets cold iron, water runs down the walls. That water freezes, and then you are sleeping inside a block of ice. Not if the outside is banked. Banked with what? You have no sod. You have river mud that will crack when it freezes. Mud and straw, packed tight. My father said, Your father is dead, Ragna. The words hung in the air between them. Marit had not meant them cruelly. She had meant them practically, which was worse, because practical cruelty does not apologize. Iron sweats, Marit continued. Iron freezes. Iron burns if a fire gets too close to bedding or straw. A child cannot live in a stove. Ragna looked at the bread in Marit's hand. She was hungry enough that the bread occupied a larger portion of her attention than the argument did. A child cannot live in a plank lean-to either. I tried that the first night. Marit set the bread on a timber and stood with her arms folded. She was not hostile. She was frightened. Frightened for a child she could not afford to take in and could not afford to watch die. If you had come to me in August and said you wanted to build something, I would have helped you cut timber. If you had come to me in September, I would have found you a corner in someone's cabin. But it is October, Ragna. The storms have already started. You cannot build a house now, and you cannot make this, she gestured at the shell, into something that keeps a person alive. Then I will die in something that stops the wind instead of dying in something that does not. Marit opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the shell again, looked at the girl with rust-stained hands and a face that had gone thin in 2 weeks and eyes that were too steady for 13. Eat the bread, Marit said. I will see what I have. She walked back up the bluff without turning around. Ragna ate the bread in 4 bites, standing in the wind, and then went back to scraping. Birgit Lunde came 3 days after Marit. She did not bring bread. Birgit was 35, sharp-featured, and married to the brother of the man who held store credit for the settlement. That connection gave her a particular kind of power, the power of a woman who knew exactly who owed what to whom and was not shy about mentioning it. She had a specific interest in Ragna's situation that went beyond community concern. Ragna's dead mother had owed a laundry debt, and as long as Ragna remained present and unclaimed, the debt remained tangled. If the girl left or died, the Brecka possessions, including her mother's sewing chest, which held decent needles and a bone-handled scissors worth actual money, could be absorbed without dispute. Birgit also despised disorder. An orphan girl living outside any household, digging in river mud, sleeping near a rusted machine. This was the kind of irregularity that made Birgit's jaw tighten. It suggested that the system she benefited from was capable of producing outcomes that looked, from certain angles, like abandonment. She brought Pater with her. That was the power move. She could not command the deacon, but she could suggest a visit, and Pater's sense of responsibility would do the rest. They stood above the landing on the bluff road, and Ragna heard them before she saw them. Birgit's voice carried the way voices carry when the speaker does not care who hears. Look at her. She means to winter in a kettle. Ragna kept working. She was on her hands and knees inside the shell, packing clay into a seam near the base, where she had found a hairline gap between 2 riveted plates. The clay was cold and stiff, and her fingers were numb, but the work was precise, and precision was the only authority she had. They came down the path. Pater first, because he always went first. Birgit behind, keeping her skirt hem above the mud, with a grip that suggested the mud was personally offensive. Pater ducked his head and looked into the furnace opening. Ragna had cleaned enough of the interior by now to reveal the curved iron wall, the raised sleeping platform she had built from salvaged pallets, and a crude fire footing of stones and broken brick at the entrance. It was ugly. It was also the most windproof space on the landing. You have cleared the sediment, Pater said. That was acknowledgement, not approval. Most of it. The far end is still packed. And you mean to sleep here? I mean to live here. Pater straightened. He looked at Birgit, then back at Ragna. The shell has no chimney. If you build a fire inside and close that opening, smoke will fill the space in minutes. If you leave the opening clear, you have a draft path that defeats the purpose. I am building a vent, Ragna said. There is a pipe section in the freight debris. If I can fit it through the upper curve near the far end, if. That is a word that does not keep a person warm. Birgit stepped forward. She had been waiting for the right moment, and this was it. The moment when practical objection had created an opening for something sharper. When frost takes you, do not have them say we left you unwarned. I am saying it now before witnesses. This is madness, and you have been told. Ragna looked at her. She understood what Birgit was doing. She understood the debt, the sewing chest, the tidiness of a dead girl's accounts. She also understood that responding with anger would give Birgit exactly what she wanted. Proof that the child was unstable, emotional, unfit. Then I had best finish before dark, Ragna said. She turned back to the seam and pressed clay into the gap with both thumbs. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Pater touched Birgit's elbow, and they walked back up the path. Ragna heard Birgit's voice on the wind, clipped and certain. A week, 2 at most. Then someone will have to carry what is left of her. Ragna pressed clay until her thumbs bled. The days blurred into a rhythm of labor and cold. Ragna fell into it the way a person falls into water, with a gasp, and then with the grim recognition that the only direction was forward. She woke before dawn each morning on the pallet platform inside the shell. The air was cold but still. Outside the furnace opening, the world was moving, wind dragging across the bluff face, rattling the loose timbers of the freight platform, pushing the dead reeds flat against the frozen mud. Inside, nothing moved. The iron walls held the air like cupped hands. Each morning she reviewed her list. She did not write it down because she had no paper and no pencil, but she carried it in her mind the way her father had carried specifications, numbered, ordered, urgent. Clear the remaining silt from the far end of the shell. Dry the interior with small controlled fires. Seal every gap she could find with clay and mud. Bank the exterior with packed earth and straw. Find and fit a vent pipe. Build a better fire footing. Hang an inner curtain to create a smaller sleeping chamber within the already small space. Construct a draft door for the furnace opening. 8 tasks. Each one required materials she did not have, skills she was still learning, and time that was running out at the speed of the season. She scraped sludge from the lower drum area with a bent spoon, a piece of wire she had straightened from a barrel hoop, and the edge of a board. The sediment was dense, packed mud and mineral scale that had accumulated during years of river operation and years more of sitting in the floodplain. Her father had told her once that the mud drum in a river boiler collected the worst of what the water carried, and that cleaning it was the dirtiest job on the boat. He had been right. The stuff came out in chunks that smelled of rot and metal, and it coated her arms to the elbows. She built small fires at the furnace opening to dry the interior, feeding them with broken plank ends and watching the smoke. This was where the first real problem appeared. The smoke should have risen and dispersed. Instead, it pooled inside the upper curve of the cylinder and hung there, thickening, until Ragna's eyes streamed and her chest seized. She killed the fire and crawled out, gasping. The flue path was still fouled. Sediment and debris blocked the channels where hot gases had once traveled through the boiler's length, and without a clear path, the smoke had nowhere to go but into the living space. She spent an entire day lying on her back inside the shell, reaching into narrow passages with a stick in her bare hands, pulling out handfuls of compacted filth. By evening, she had opened enough of the passage to allow a weak draw, but the smoke still curled and eddied in corners, and she knew that a fire large enough to warm the space would still choke her. She needed a vent. She needed it soon. And the pipe section she had seen in the freight debris was buried under a collapsed timber pile she could not move alone. The first snow came that night. Not a storm. A quiet fall that covered the mud in white and made the landing look clean in a way that was a lie. Ragna watched it through the furnace opening, wrapped in both blankets, and calculated. She had spent $4 of her $11 on nails from the settlement store, carried down by Marit's daughter Christy, who had made the purchase without explaining who it was for. She had spent another $1.50 on a lump of clay from the brickmaker's scrap pile, ferried to the landing by the same route. She had $6 left, which sounded like money until she priced what she still needed: a stovepipe elbow, strap hinges, and wire for hanging the inner curtain. The stovepipe alone would cost $3 if she could find one. $6. A partial vent. An unfinished shell. Snow on the ground and the temperature dropping by the week. Pater Moen's arithmetic had been right. She could not argue with the numbers. She could only argue with the conclusion. She pulled the blanket tighter and watched her breath whiten in the dark, and thought about her father's hands pressing hers against warm iron, and she did not sleep for a long time. The rust and the cold and the scraping took their toll in ways that accumulated instead of arriving all at once. Her hands split first. The combination of river mud, iron oxide, and freezing air opened cracks along her knuckles and fingertips that bled into the clay she was packing and stained her work pink. She wrapped her hands in strips torn from her extra stocking, but the strips got wet and frozen cloth on open cuts was worse than bare skin. Her shoulders ached from reaching overhead to scrape the upper interior curve. Her knees ached from crawling in and out of the furnace opening dozens of times a day. She ate once in the morning, a thin porridge made from her diminishing flour, cooked in the cracked kettle over a fire that had to be watched constantly because the vent was not yet working properly. And once, at dusk, whatever Marit's daughter had slipped her, a potato, a strip of dried meat, a heel of bread that was more crust than crumb. She was losing weight she could not afford to lose. Her coat hung differently. Her wrists showed bones she had not seen before, but the shell was changing too. By the end of the second week, she had cleared the silt from 3/4 of the interior. The sleeping platform sat a foot above the floor on salvaged pallet wood, keeping her body above the coldest air that pooled at the bottom of the cylinder. She had banked the lower exterior with a mix of mud, straw, and river clay packed to the thickness of her forearm. It had cracked in 2 places when the temperature dropped, and she had repacked it, and it had cracked again, and she had repacked it again with more straw mixed in for binding. The seams were mostly sealed. The hairline gap near the base was packed solid with clay. 2 other spots where rivets had loosened enough to admit a whisper of air were stuffed with wool scraps and covered with mud. Then Birgit's nephew stole 2 of her dry boards. She came back from hauling mud to find the pile short. 2 planks, good planks, dry and straight, that she had set aside for the inner curtain frame, were gone. Boot prints in the mud led up the bluff path. She knew whose boots they were because there was only one boy in the settlement with a nail-scarred left sole, and that boy was Birgit's 16-year-old nephew, who had a reputation for taking anything that was not watched, and a family that did not correct him. She stood in the cold and stared at the prints, and felt something she had been keeping behind a wall rise up in her chest. Not grief. Rage. The hot, specific rage of a person who has counted every resource and cannot afford to lose a single one. She did not go up the bluff to confront him. She knew what would happen if she did. His word against hers, and his family held the store credit. Instead, she took the next 2 best boards from the wreckage, and they were not as straight and not as dry, and the work would take longer because of it. That night she lay on the pallet in the dark and listened to the river ice groan and felt the rage settle into something harder and quieter and more useful. She would finish. She would finish not because she believed she could, but because the alternative was to prove every person on that bluff correct. She had been told she could not argue with the Dakota winter. She had been told that iron was not shelter, and that a child was not labor, and that desperation was not a plan. Pater had said it with arithmetic. Marit had said it with worry. Birgit had said it with satisfaction. And all of them were reasonable. All of them were looking at the same evidence and drawing the same conclusion. But none of them had stood inside the shell when the wind was blowing and felt the air go still. The next morning, before the sun cleared the bluff, she started digging out the buried pipe section from the freight pile. It took her 6 hours, working alone, to shift enough timber to reach it. The pipe was 18 inches long, rusted at the flange but solid in the body. When she held it up to the light, she could see through it. She carried it into the shell and held it against the upper curve near the far end, where the iron was thinnest, and the curve would allow a crude penetration if she could punch or pry a hole. She did not have a drill. She did not have a punch. She had a hatchet with a split handle and a pile of nails and the kind of stubbornness that adults mistake for stupidity in children. She started hammering a nail through the iron from the inside, working by feel in the dim light, hitting the nail head with the flat of the hatchet in short, careful strokes that sent sparks into the dark. The first nail bent, the second nail bent, the third nail went through. She was still hammering when the light failed, and she worked on in the dark by sound and touch, and the ring of iron on iron carried up the bluff where no one was listening. She met Niels Tveit on the morning she nearly killed herself with smoke. It was the third week of October. She had fitted the pipe section into a hole she had punched and widened through the upper shell curve, sealing the gap around it with clay and bent iron scraps. The fit was poor. Clay crumbled at the edges, but when she lit a test fire at the furnace opening and watched the smoke, some of it, not all, not even most, but some, found the pipe and climbed through and emerged into the outside air. She fed the fire larger because she was cold and because she wanted to believe. The wood caught faster than she expected. The furnace opening drew air in, which was correct, but the fire sent more smoke than the crude vent could handle, and within 2 minutes the shell was thick with it. She could not see the far wall. Her throat closed. She dropped to her belly where the air was clearest and crawled toward the furnace opening, but the fire was there, blocking half the exit, and the heat hit her face and she rolled sideways and pressed her cheek to the iron floor and coughed until something inside her chest felt torn. A hand grabbed her ankle and pulled. She came out of the furnace opening feet first, dragged across the fire-footing stones, and deposited on the frozen mud outside. The cold air hit her lungs like water. She coughed, retched, and coughed again, and when she could see through the tears, a man was standing over her with a face that looked like it had been carved from riverwood and left in the weather for 60 years. "You fired too fast," he said, "and your draw is blocked at the turn." Ragna wiped her eyes with her wrist and looked at him. He was tall and thin, leaning on a stick that was not a walking stick by design, but had become one by necessity. His left leg was stiff below the knee, an old injury, badly healed, that made him stand with his weight shifted right. His coat was patched so many times it was more patch than coat. His hands were large, scarred, and steady. "Who are you?" Ragna asked, and then coughed again. "Niels Tveit. I live on the ferry road, which you would know if you had been here longer than 3 weeks." He looked at the smoke still pouring from the furnace opening. "That is a number 4 Western River boiler, tubular return flue, or it was before someone stripped the tubes. Built in Pittsburgh or Cincinnati, I would guess, from the rivet pattern." He tapped the shell with his stick. "I have not seen one this intact this far upriver in 15 years. Ragna stared at him. "You know what it is." "I spent 9 years on the river, 3 of them in engine rooms. I know what everything on this landing is." He looked at her with the same assessing gaze Pater had used, except that where Pater had been measuring load capacity, this man was measuring something else. "You cleaned the sediment out of the drum, the mud drum. You knew to do that." "My father told me that sediment collects in the low places." "Your father was correct. What was his name?" "Halvor Brekke." Niels was quiet for a moment. "I knew a Halvor Brekke. Boiler Hand's helper on the far west. Or was it the Rosebud? No, the far west. He had a burn scar on his forearm from a pop valve." "Both forearms," Ragna said, "and his chest. The second time killed him." Niels looked at her again. The assessment in his eyes shifted to something else, not pity, which Ragna would have hated, but recognition. He recognized what she was doing because he recognized where the knowledge came from. "Your vent pipe is too short and too low," he said, "and you have packed the exterior seal too tight around the pipe collar. The clay is choking the draw. You need a gap at the collar, a finger width, and the pipe needs to rise above the shell's peak, or the wind will push smoke back down. I do not have a longer pipe. You have 3 feet of pipe buried under that timber pile. I saw it last spring." He pointed with his stick toward the collapsed freight platform. "3rd layer down, behind the broken rudder stock." Ragna looked at the pile. She had spent 6 hours digging out the first pipe section. The idea of digging again, deeper, through more timber, made her arms ache before she started. Niels read her face. I cannot dig, he said, and tapped his stiff leg. But I can tell you where to dig, and I can tell you how to set the pipe so you do not gas yourself again. Why? He considered the question. Because you noticed the wind problem before the heat problem. That is not luck. That is your father's thinking in your hands. He shifted his weight on the stick. And because if you die in that shell, I will have to listen to Pater Moan explain why arithmetic is always right. And I have heard that speech enough for one life. Ragna almost smiled. She did not, because smiling felt like a concession she could not afford, but she came close. Show me where to dig, she said. Niels Tveit was 62 years old and had been half lame for 7 years, ever since a loading crane dropped a barrel on his left knee at the Bismarck landing, and no one set the bone properly because there was no one on the landing who knew how. He lived alone in a shack near the old ferry road crossing, a mile south of the settlement, which meant he was close enough to trade for supplies, but far enough that the settlement did not count him as theirs. He had spent 9 years on Missouri River steamers, not as an engineer, but as an engineer's assistant, which meant he did the work without the title and learned the machinery without the certificate. He could read a boiler the way Ragna's father had read one, by sound and touch, and the behavior of steam. And he understood the physics of heat transfer, not in the language of textbooks, but in the language of a man who had watched boilers fail and succeed and kill and save across 1,000 miles of river. He did not move into the landing. He did not take charge. He came down the bluff path each morning around 8, walking slowly on his bad leg, carrying his stick and sometimes a tool wrapped in cloth. And he sat on the overturned crate Ragna had set near the furnace opening and watched her work and told her what she was doing wrong. The first thing he taught her was how to read smoke. He had her light a small fire, small, not the roaring blaze she had built before, and hold a dampened straw near the shell's seams one by one. Where the straw smoke moved inward, air was being drawn in. Where it moved outward, pressure was escaping. Where it hung motionless, the seal was tight. Smoke does not lie, Niels said. Your eyes can be wrong, your hands can be numb, but smoke goes where the air goes, and the air goes where the gaps are. Ragna circled the shell with the damp straw and a candle stub Niels had brought, marking each leak point with a scratch from a nail. She found 7. 3 were at the base where her mud banking had cracked. 2 were at the rivet seams she thought she had sealed. 1 was at the pipe collar. 1 was at a spot she had not even noticed, where the shell wall met a structural brace, and the iron had separated just enough to admit a thread of air. 7 leaks, each one a channel for the wind to steal what she was trying to keep. She sealed them. Niels watched and corrected. He told her to use a mix of clay and ash for the rivet seams. Ash was finer, filled smaller gaps, and to layer the mud banking in thin coats, letting each coat freeze before adding the next, instead of packing one thick layer that would crack as it contracted. He told her to keep the pipe collar gap open and instead build a small clay hood above the pipe exit to deflect wind without blocking the draw. The fire wants to breathe, Niels said. Let it breathe through the places you choose. Block everything else. The second thing he taught her was how to manage the fire itself. Ragna had been building fires the way most people build fires, as large as the fuel allowed, as hot as the space needed. Niels told her she was wrong about everything. A hot fire is a fast fire, he said. It eats your wood and gives you an hour of heat and then nothing. You do not need an hour of heat. You need 12 hours of heat, so you feed it small, you bank it often, you keep the coals alive and the flame low. The iron around you will hold the warmth from the coals longer than you think, because iron is slow to cool when the wind cannot reach it. He showed her how to arrange fuel in the fire footing, not piled, but stacked with gaps that allowed air from below. He showed her how to bank coals with ash at night, leaving a breathing space the width of 2 fingers so the fire would not die but would not consume either. He showed her how to position stones around the fire footing to reflect heat inward toward the sleeping platform rather than letting it rise straight up to the pipe vent and escape. "You are not heating the air," Niels said. "Air moves. You are heating the iron. The iron holds. The iron gives the heat back to you all night." The third thing he taught her came 3 days later when Ragna woke to find her blankets damp. She had sealed the shell so well that the moisture from her breath, the fire, and her own body had nowhere to go. It condensed on the cold iron walls and dripped onto her bedding. By morning, the wool was clammy and her lungs felt tight. She showed Niels the wet blankets. He nodded as if he had been waiting for this. "You sealed everything. Good. Now open one thing." He pointed to the vent pipe. "Twice a day, morning and before sleep, you open the furnace door full and let the air move through for the time it takes to count 100. Cold air in, wet air out, then close it again. That loses heat. That saves your lungs. A woman with wet lungs in January is a dead woman in February. The heat you lose in 2 minutes, you gain back in 20. The damage wet air does to bedding and breathing, you never gain back." Ragna vented that evening, standing at the furnace opening with the cold pouring in, counting to 100, watching her breath whiten and feeling the damp air pull past her and out. It felt wrong. Every instinct said to keep the heat in, to seal every gap, to hoard warmth the way she hoarded flour. But when she closed the door again and rebuilt the fire, the air inside was cleaner. The blankets dried by morning. She did not thank Niels. He did not expect thanks. The relationship was not sentimental. It was a partnership between unequal people who respected each other's knowledge, his earned across 9 years on the river, hers inherited from a dead father, and being tested now in conditions neither of them would have chosen. By late October, the calendar was turning against her. The mud banking cracked again after a night of sleet. She repacked it in the morning and added a layer of dead grass pressed flat against the clay before the next mud coat, which helped. The grass bound the mud the way straw bound plaster. But the repair cost her half a day she had planned to spend on the inner curtain, and the curtain mattered because the sleeping chamber needed to be smaller than the full shell interior to hold heat efficiently. She bought the stovepipe elbow from the settlement store for $2.75, passing the coins up through Christy, who was becoming her supply line, a 9-year-old smuggling hardware to an exile, which would have been funny if everything about it were not also desperate. The elbow let her angle the vent pipe properly, rising above the shell peak the way Niels had described. The draw improved immediately. She could burn a small fire for an hour without the smoke thickening past what her eyes could tolerate. She hung the inner curtain, a wool blanket suspended on wire from nails driven into the upper curve, and the effect was immediate. The sleeping chamber behind the curtain was perhaps 6 feet long and 4 feet across. With a low fire at the furnace end and the curtain trapping warmth between the hot iron walls and the sleeping platform, the air behind the curtain was 10 or 15 degrees warmer than the air in front of it. She could not measure the difference in numbers. She measured it with her body. Behind the curtain, her fingers did not stiffen in the first 5 minutes. She built the draft door from a flattened biscuit tin and strap hinges salvaged from a crate. It covered 2/3 of the furnace opening, leaving space for the fire footing below and a gap above for smoke to escape toward the vent. With the door closed, the wind could not blow directly into the shell. With it open, she could feed the fire and clear ash. Niels inspected everything. He tapped the walls, checked the seams with damp straw, watched the smoke behavior through 3 complete fire cycles, and said one word: adequate. From Niels, adequate was an accolade, but the work was not done. The exterior banking needed to be thicker and higher. The fire-footing stones needed resetting because two had shifted. The sleeping platform needed a layer of dry grass under the blankets for insulation from below. The vent cap needed a cover for heavy snow. And she needed a supply of fuel that would last longer than a week. She had $3.25 left. Winter was 6 weeks away. The temperature had already dropped below freezing on 12 of the last 14 nights. And Peter Moen came down the bluff path for the second time. He came alone. No Birgit, no witnesses. He came in the afternoon when the light was flat and gray, and he stood outside the shell and looked at what Ragna had built, the way a man looks at an equation that produces an answer he did not expect. "You are still here," he said. "I'm still here." He walked around the shell, examining the banking, the vent pipe, the drainage channel she had dug to keep meltwater from pooling at the base. He put his hand on the exterior mud and felt the texture. He looked at the fire footing through the draft door. He did none of this with warmth or apology. He did it with the clinical attention of a man reviewing construction. "How much wood are you burning a day?" he asked. "A quarter cord lasts me 4 to 5 days, with banking the coals overnight." Peter was silent for a moment. Ragna saw him doing the math. A quarter cord for 4 to 5 days was radically less than any cabin on the bluff was burning. His own household went through twice that in half the time, and his cabin was the best chinked structure in the settlement. "That is because the space is small," he said. Not a concession, an explanation to himself. "That is because the wind cannot reach the fire," Ragna said. Peter looked at her. For the first time, something moved behind his eyes that was not judgment or assessment. It might have been surprise. It might have been discomfort. He did not name it, and Ragna did not push. "A lucky mild spell proves nothing," Peter said. "When the real cold comes, January cold, blizzard cold, iron will freeze through no matter what you pack against it. This is not a house, Ragna. This is a barrel you have crawled into." "Then I will know in January." He left without another word, but he had come alone, and he had measured her fuel consumption, and he had not told her to stop. Ragna filed these facts the way she filed everything now, as data points in a calculation that was not yet complete. November deepened. The river froze fully below the landing, a solid white plate that groaned and cracked at night like a living thing complaining in its sleep. The wind came harder. The temperature dropped into ranges Ragna could track only by the behavior of water. The barrel outside froze solid, then the bucket inside froze at the edges, then the damp cloth she used to wipe her face froze stiff between her hand and her cheek. Each morning she checked the banking, checked the seams, checked the vent, and built her fire. Each evening she banked the coals, vented the moisture, pulled the curtain closed, and lay on the platform listening to the wind try to find a way in. The wind could not find a way in. It tried. She heard it searching, running along the shell's curve, probing the banking, whistling at the vent cap, pressing against the draft door. But the iron held. The clay held. The packed mud and straw held. The shell was not comfortable. It was not warm in any way a person from a proper house would recognize as warm, but it was still. The air inside did not move, and in that stillness, the small heat from the banked coals spread through the iron walls and radiated inward, and Ragna slept. Not well, not deeply, but she slept, and she woke alive. And each morning that fact was a small, hard victory she did not have words for. Meals came every day the weather allowed. On the bad days, the days when the wind would have knocked him off the bluff path, he stayed in his shack and she worked alone. On the passable days, he sat on his crate and they talked through what needed fixing, what could be improved, and what would happen when the weather turned from cold to killing. "You have built a survival chamber," Niels said in mid-November. "That is not the same as a winter dwelling. You can survive a week in this, a month, maybe two. But if January comes the way it came in 73, you will need more than this shell. You will need fuel reserves you do not have, and food reserves you do not have, and a plan for what happens when the vent clogs with ice and the fire goes out at 3 in the morning." What happened in 73? People died. Not all of them in bad houses, some of them in good houses where the fire went out, and they could not relight it because the wood was buried and the door was drifted shut, and the cold came in faster than the body could make heat. He looked at her steadily. The shell gives you one advantage. The wind cannot steal your heat, but it gives you one disadvantage that a cabin does not have. If the fire goes out, you cannot build a second one in a different room. You have one fire and one space and no margin. Then the fire does not go out. Then the fire does not go out, Niels agreed, which means you do not sleep through the night, which means you do not rest, which means by February you're making mistakes because you're exhausted, and the cold does not forgive mistakes. He was right. She knew he was right. She adjusted. She set a system. Bank the coals at 10 in the evening, sleep until 2 in the morning, rise and feed the fire, sleep until dawn, rise and feed the fire again. The system cost her a full night's rest. She paid it. The currency of survival was not dollars. It was hours of sleep she could not afford and spent anyway. Her palm, cut on a rivet seam during the early construction, had healed poorly. A ridge of scar tissue ran from the base of her thumb to the center of her palm, and in the cold it stiffened and cracked, and gripping the shovel or the hatchet sent a sharp line of pain up her forearm. She wrapped it. The wrapping got wet. She dried the wrapping by the fire and wrapped it again. This cycle repeated daily and would repeat daily until spring. She was thin, thinner than she had been when her mother died. Her flour was running low. Marit's daughter still brought small offerings, a potato, a strip of jerky, once a jar of rendered fat that was the most valuable thing anyone had given her because fat meant calories and calories meant body heat. But Marit was rationing too, and the offerings were growing smaller as the settlement's own stores tightened. By late November, the shell was working. Not perfectly, not the way a house works, with rooms and doors and space to stand upright and a fire that someone else can tend while you rest. But working. Ragna's wash water skinned with ice near the draft door, but stayed liquid behind the inner curtain. Frost formed on the far end of the shell, where the banking was thinnest, but not over the sleeping platform. She could dry one pair of stockings overnight for the first time in weeks, hanging them on a wire near the vent pipe where the rising warm air caught them. Niels showed her a final refinement, a short firing at dusk, 20 minutes of active flame to heat the iron walls, followed by a deep banking of coals before sleep, and a smaller feeding at the 2 o'clock rise. The system used less wood than her previous method and produced steadier warmth because the iron itself became the heat source after the flame died. The coals kept the iron warm. The iron kept the air warm. The air kept her alive. On the bluff, things were different. Marit told her in fragments passed down through Christie or during her own rare visits. The cabins were burning through wood at a rate nobody had planned for. October had been colder than expected. November was worse. 3 households had sent men to cut timber from the cottonwood stands 2 miles south, and the labor of cutting, hauling, and splitting in worsening conditions was consuming the same men who needed to be home tending fires and feeding stock. Pater's cabin, the best chinked, the most admired, the standard by which all others were judged, had developed a crack along the south wall where the logs had shifted as the green wood dried. The chinking held in mild cold. In hard wind, it leaked. Pater had rechinked twice. The The second chinking held for 3 days before the wind found the seam again. Birgit's household had more room than most, which was now a disadvantage. A larger interior space required more fuel to heat, and the corners farthest from the stove stayed cold enough to freeze water in a cup overnight. Birgit's children slept in a cluster near the stove, which meant they were warm but also near the smoke, and the youngest had developed a cough. None of this changed anyone's public opinion of Ragna's shell. The settlement still called it the kettle. Men still shook their heads when they passed on the bluff road. Birgit still said, to anyone who would listen, that desperation makes people confuse stubbornness with wisdom. But Marit had stopped saying the shell would fail. She had stopped saying anything about it at all, which was its own kind of conversion. And then December came, and the sky went white, and the dying started. The storm arrived on a Thursday in the second week of December, after 2 days of false calm that had tricked even Niels into thinking the worst weather was still weeks away. The calm was the kind that frontier people learned to distrust. Too still, too clear. The sky a hard blue that looked painted rather than real. The temperature dropped steadily through Wednesday, but without wind, and the cold felt manageable, almost gentle compared to November's worst. By Thursday morning, the sky was the color of iron. By noon, the wind had come back, and it had brought everything it had been saving. Ragna felt the change before she heard it. The shell's walls, which had been radiating the steady, slow warmth of the morning fire, began to cool faster than they should have. She pressed her hand to the iron and felt the heat draining out as if the metal were bleeding. That meant the exterior temperature was dropping fast and the wind was accelerating the loss. She fed the fire. She checked the vent. She pulled the curtain closed and sat behind it with her knees drawn up. And then the sound arrived. The wind did not build gradually. It hit the bluff face like a fist. The shell rang, a deep, hollow tone that vibrated through the walls and into the platform and into Ragna's bones. The vent pipe screamed as air forced past it. Sand and ice crystals rattled against the exterior banking in a continuous hiss that sounded like water boiling. She could see nothing through the furnace door gap. The air outside had turned white, not with snow falling from above, but with snow being driven sideways off the ground, off the bluff face, off the river ice, every surface surrendering its cover to the wind. The first hour was manageable. The fire drew properly because the vent pipe rose above the wind line. The banking held. The curtain barely moved. Inside the sleeping chamber, the air was cold, colder than it had been any night since she had sealed the shell, but it was still, and the difference between cold, still air and cold, moving air was the difference between discomfort and death. Then the drift started building against the furnace opening. She noticed it when the fire began to dim, not because the fuel was spent, but because the airflow into the firebox was decreasing. Snow was packing against the draft door, filling the gap she had left for combustion air. She opened the door and pushed at the drift with the shovel. It was dense and wet and heavy. She cleared it. 10 minutes later, it was back, deeper than before. This was the first complication. Without air reaching the fire would die. Without the fire, the iron would cool in hours. Without warm iron, the shell was just a metal tube in a blizzard. She kept the shovel by the door and cleared the drift every 15 minutes. The work was exhausting. Each time she opened the draft door, the wind drove snow and ice into the shell, and each time she cleared the drift, her hands and arms were exposed to conditions that turned skin white in minutes. She wrapped her hands in double cloth. The cloth froze. She rotated between 2 sets of wrappings, warming one by the fire while wearing the other. It was a system. It worked. It was also unsustainable. She could not clear a drift every 15 minutes for 3 days. Then the vent clogged. She heard it, a change in the sound of the fire, a thickening of the air. Smoke began to curl back from the vent pipe instead of drawing through it. Wet snow had packed over the vent cap and sealed it. The fire was now burning in a closed space, consuming the oxygen and replacing it with smoke. Ragna dropped to the floor where the air was clearest and thought. She could not reach the vent from outside. It was on the upper curve of the shell, 8 feet off the ground, and the blizzard outside would kill her before she could climb anything. She could not clear it from inside. The pipe was too narrow to reach through. She killed the fire. That was the hardest decision she had made since crawling into the shell for the first time. Without fire, the cold would come. But with smoke, the death would come faster. She scooped ash over the coals and sat in the dark behind the curtain and counted. If the vent cap was clogged with wet snow, the heat rising through the pipe might melt it. She needed the pipe warm, but the fire out. She wrapped a heated stone in cloth and held it against the pipe base, pushing warmth upward through the metal. She counted to 300. She counted to 500. At 600, she heard a hiss and a pop, and felt the draw resume. The wet snow had melted or shifted enough to open a gap, and air began moving through the pipe again. She rebuilt the fire from the banked coals, hands shaking, and the flame caught, and the smoke climbed, and she sat back on her heels and breathed. That was 3 hours into the storm. The storm would last 2 more days. On the bluff, the cabins were failing. Rana did not know this yet. She would not learn the details until after the storm broke. But Marit's eldest son, a boy of 16 named Tolef, tried to reach the wood stack during the first night and made it 30 yards before the wind knocked him flat. He crawled back. His hands and face were white when he came through the door, and Marit spent the next 4 hours rubbing life back into his fingers, while the fire in their cabin consumed wood at a rate that meant their reserves would be gone 2 weeks before the end of winter. In Pater's cabin, the south wall seam opened again. The wind found the crack and drove cold air in like a blade. The stovepipe, which had never drawn well in high wind, began to back smoke into the room. Pater's wife, Beret, had been fighting a chest cold for a week. The smoke made it worse. By the first night of the storm, she was coughing blood. Pater re-chinked the seam in the dark, working by feel, pressing mud and moss into a crack he could not see. The chinking held for 2 hours before the wind pulled it out again. He re-chinked a second time. It held for 1 hour. He re-chinked a third time with a mix of mud, animal fat, and cloth strips. That held. But the damage was done. Beret had spent 6 hours breathing coal draft and wood smoke, and her lungs were filling with fluid. In Birgit's house, the larger interior space that had been a point of pride became a trap. The stove could not heat the corners. The family retreated to the area nearest the fire, but 6 people in a tight cluster near a hot stove in a smoky room created its own problems. Birgit's youngest coughed through the night. The older children sat rigid and silent, watching the fire as if it were the last living thing in the world. A bachelor named Embret Hogan, who lived alone in a board shanty below the bluff road not far from Ragna's landing, stopped feeding his fire at some point during the first night. Whether he fell asleep or ran out of fuel or simply gave up, no one knew. He was found after the storm, alive but senseless, his feet blackened with frostbite. He would lose 3 toes. He would never walk properly again, and someone's milk cow died in the drift behind Birgit's barn. The animal was found standing, frozen upright, dusted with white, its eyes open, as if it had died too fast to fall. Ragna knew none of this during the storm. She knew only the shell, the fire, the drift, the vent, and the clock she was running against. She settled into a rotation that was as precise and relentless as anything Niels had taught her. Every 15 minutes, clear the drift at the furnace opening. Every hour, Check the vent pipe for clogging. Every 2 hours, feed the fire. Every 4 hours, vent moisture by cracking the draft door for a 60 count, then sealing it again. Between these tasks, she sat behind the curtain and listened to the wind try to kill her and fail. The shell held. The iron did not crack. The banking did not collapse. The seams she had packed with clay and ash did not open. The wind ran over the curved surface and kept going, finding no edge to grip, no gap to exploit. The snow drifted against the exterior and added a layer of insulation that Ragna had not planned for, but accepted with the grim gratitude of a person who takes every advantage the world accidentally offers. On the second morning, something changed. The fire was drawing well. The vent was clear. The drift at the furnace opening had stabilized. The snow had packed so densely that new snow was now sliding over it instead of building further. Ragna sat behind the curtain with a heated stone in her lap and realized that she was not warm. She was never warm, but she was alive, and her hands worked, and her lungs were clear, and the air in the sleeping chamber was still. Then she heard a sound that was not wind. A voice, muffled, distorted, but human, calling her name from somewhere above. She opened the draft door and pushed through the drift gap and saw a figure on the bluff path, bent double against the wind, moving with the slow, wrong-legged gait she recognized even through the driving snow. Niels. He had come down the bluff path in the storm, on his bad leg, in conditions that had knocked a 16-year-old boy flat. He was carrying something under his coat. She could not see what, and his face was red and white in patches that meant the cold was already damaging skin. She pulled him inside. The furnace opening was barely large enough for 2 people to pass through, and Niels's stiff leg made the crawl awkward and painful. He came through gasping, and she sealed the door behind him, and for a moment they sat in the smoke-tinged dark and listened to each other breathe. "Peter's wife," Niels said. His voice was rough. "Beret. Her lungs are filling. Their cabin lost the south seam last night and the smoke backed up. She needs still air. She needs warmth without smoke." Ragna looked at the sleeping chamber. It was built for one person, one small person. "He is asking?" she said. "He is not asking yet. He will. I came ahead because when he asks, you need to be ready." The weight of that settled on her like a physical thing. Peter Moen, the man who had handed her exile papers through a 9-year-old girl, who had said no house had wood enough for charity, who had called her shell a barrel, was going to ask her for help. He was going to carry his sick wife down the bluff path in a blizzard and ask a 13-year-old girl to take her into the iron space the settlement called a kettle. "How many?" Ragna asked. "Beret. Maybe Peter. Maybe the Vangen boy with the frozen hands. 3, plus you, plus me." She looked at the dimensions of the shell. She calculated air, heat, fuel, and vent capacity the way Niels had taught her, and she said the truth. "It will be tight. The fire needs to stay small. The vent must stay clear, as they cannot panic. They will not panic. They will be too cold to panic." Peter came an hour later. He did not come alone. He carried Beret on his back, wrapped in every blanket their household owned, and behind him came Marit's son Tolef, supported by Marit herself, who had left her other children in the cabin under the care of the eldest daughter, because the boy's hands had swollen overnight and she was afraid he was losing fingers. They came down the bluff path in a line, bent against the wind, holding each other, and when they reached the landing, Peter looked at the furnace opening of the boiler shell and did not speak. He stood in the blizzard holding his sick wife on his back and stared at the iron cylinder he had dismissed as junk and the girl he had dismissed as charity and the small controlled fire burning inside the space he had said could not exist. Ragna said, Bring her in. They converted the shell from a one-person survival chamber into a compact refuge. Ragna moved the inner curtain back to create more floor space. Niels directed the placement of bodies, beret against the warmest section of curved wall, where the iron still held radiant heat from the fire. Tollef next to her, with his hands wrapped in dry cloth and pressed between heated stones. Peter seated with his back to the wall near the furnace end, where he could help feed the fire without being told. Marit looked at the arrangement and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "The air is still." "Yes," Ragna said. "In my cabin, the air is not still. The air is never still." "I know." They were 6 people in a space built for one. The air should have been suffocating. Instead, it was close, warm, smoky at the margins, but breathable at the center, and still. The wind raged outside. It screamed past the vent pipe. It pounded the banking and drove snow against the iron walls until the shell sounded like a drum. But inside, the air did not move. Ragna fed the fire small and often. Niels monitored the vent. Peter, without being asked, took over the drift-clearing rotation at the furnace door, using his greater strength to push snow that would have taken Ragna twice the effort. They fell into a rhythm that was wordless and precise, and the shell held them the way a cupped hand holds water, not comfortably, not generously, but completely. Beret's breathing eased by midnight. The still air, free of the draft and smoke that had been filling her lungs in the cabin, let her rest for the first time in days. Tollef's fingers, warmed between heated stones, regained color. Marit sat with her back against the curved iron wall and felt heat radiating through her coat and closed her eyes. Peter fed the fire and said nothing. There was nothing to say that the iron was not already saying. By dawn of the 3rd day, the storm broke. The wind died in stages, pulling back like an animal that is tired of attacking something it cannot destroy. The snow stopped. The sky appeared, pale and distant, through the drift gap at the furnace opening. Ragna crawled outside first. The world was white and still and bright enough to hurt. The bluff above was a smooth wave of snow. The river was invisible under the drift. The landing was buried to the level of the freight platform, which meant 3 feet of snow had fallen or been driven into place over 2.5 days. She stood in the silence and felt the cold on her face, and for the first time in 3 days, the cold was only cold. It was not trying to get in. It was just there, waiting, patient, and she was alive in it. Inside the shell, Peter Mohn carried his wife out through the furnace opening. He set her feet on the packed snow and held her upright while she blinked at the light. Then he looked at Ragna. He did not say thank you. He did not say he was wrong. He said, "How much wood did you burn in 3 days?" Ragna told him. The number was less than his cabin had burned in 1 day of the same storm. Peter stood in the snow with his sick wife leaning against him, and his best cabin's south wall cracked open, and the settlement's wood reserves half gone, and the winter not yet half over, and he heard the number, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he picked Beret up and carried her back up the bluff path, and he did not look back, and Ragna did not watch him go, because there was work to do. There was always work to do. The storm left the settlement changed in ways that had nothing to do with snow depth. 3 days inside the shell had cracked something in Peter Mohn's certainty the way the south wall seam had cracked in his cabin, slowly at first, then all at once. He did not announce the crack. He did not come down the bluff path with an apology or speech. He simply stopped saying the shell would fail. And in a settlement where Peter's word carried the weight of doctrine, his silence was louder than anything he could have spoken. Beret recovered. Slowly, over a week, Her breathing cleared and the blood left her cough. Marit changed her poultices twice a day and credited the willow bark tea she had been brewing. But Marit also knew and said quietly to Christie, who said quietly to Ragna, that the night in the shell, the still air, the steady warmth, the absence of the draft that had been filling Beret's lungs with smoke and cold, had done more than the tea. The shell had given her lungs a rest. The cabin had been killing her slowly. The iron had stopped the killing. Tolef kept his fingers, all 10 of them. The heated stones and dry wrapping had saved what the blizzard had been taking. He walked down to the landing 3 days after the storm and stood outside the furnace opening and looked at the shell. The way a boy looks at something he does not have a word for. He did not say thank you. He brought a quarter cord of split cottonwood on a hand sled, stacked it against the leeward side of the banking, and walked away. That wood was worth more than anything anyone had given Ragna since her exile. It was 2 weeks of fuel. It was sleep she would not have to sacrifice. It was the settlement's first material acknowledgement that the shell was not a kettle. It was shelter. Ragna stacked the wood inside the lean-to she had rebuilt over the furnace entrance and did not cry, because crying was something she had decided not to do in October and had not changed her mind about since. Pater came on the 4th day after the storm, alone again. Same flat afternoon light, same clinical attention in his eyes. But something in his posture had shifted, a loosening around the shoulders that Ragna read as a man who was carrying a thought he had not yet decided how to set down. He stood outside the shell and looked at the banking, which had held through the storm without a single new crack. He looked at the vent pipe, which rose clean above the snow line. He looked at the drift pattern around the base, where the cylindrical shape had caused the wind to scour rather than build, keeping the lower seams clear while the bluff cabins had been buried to their window sills. "I counted wood and walls," Pater said. He did not look at Ragna when he said it. He looked at the shell. "I did not count the wind." Ragna waited. She had learned that silence was a tool as useful as a shovel, and she used it now. Every cabin on this bluff is losing heat through the walls faster than the stove can replace it. I have known this for 3 winters. I have re-chinked my own south seam 4 times since October. The problem is not the chinking. The problem is that the wind finds the seam faster than I can fill it. He turned to her. "You do not have seams." "I have iron." "You have iron, and you have something I do not understand yet, which is that your fire burns a quarter of what mine burns, and your space is warmer than my best room. The space is smaller. The walls do not leak. The shape does not catch wind. It is not complicated." "No," Pater said. "It is not complicated. That is what I did not count." He asked her then, directly, plainly, without the protective layer of authority he usually wore, whether she would show him how she had sealed the shell, not the iron itself. He knew he could not replicate that, but the principles, the banking technique, the vent management, the fire discipline, the inner curtain that created a smaller heated space within a larger enclosure. Ragna said yes. She said it without hesitation, without conditions, and without the satisfaction she might have felt if she had been a different kind of person. She said yes because the knowledge was not hers to hoard. It was her father's knowledge, filtered through Niels's teaching, tested by a Dakota blizzard, and proven by the fact that 6 people had survived in a space meant for 1. Knowledge like that belonged to anyone who needed it. Pater spent an hour inside the shell. Ragna showed him the seam work, the banking layers, the fire footing, the vent system, the inner curtain. She showed him the smoke-reading technique Niels had taught her, the damp straw, the candle stub, the patient circling of walls until every leak was found. Pater watched with the attention of a man who was not accustomed to being taught by a child, and was managing the discomfort of it by focusing on the information instead of the source. When he left, he carried a piece of damp straw in his coat pocket. Ragna saw him pull it out on the bluff path and hold it up, testing the wind direction before he disappeared over the rise. Marit came next, not through Christie, in person. She brought a loaf of bread, a whole loaf, not a heel, and a tin of rendered goose fat and a pair of wool mittens that were too large for Ragna's hands, but would cover the cracked skin she had been wrapping in cloth strips for weeks. She sat on Neil's crate outside the furnace opening and looked at the shell with eyes that had lost the grieving quality they had carried since October. "Tell me about the curtain," Marit said. Ragna told her. The wool blanket suspended on wire, dividing the shell into a fire chamber and a sleeping chamber, the smaller space behind the curtain holding heat more efficiently than the full cylinder. The way the curtain trapped a pocket of warm air against the sleeping platform, while the cooler air stayed in front, near the fire, where it was heated and cycled back. "I have 4 children," Marit said. "My cabin is 14 by 18 feet. The stove sits in the center. The children sleep along the north wall, which is the coldest wall, because the south wall is where the door is and the draft comes under the door. If I hung a curtain between the stove and the north wall, not across the whole room, just across the sleeping area, would that hold warmth the way yours does?" "It would help, but you also need to seal the draft under the door. Your door is where your wind comes in." "I have chinked under the door 3 times. Chinking is not enough if the frame has shifted. You need a threshold barrier, a rolled cloth, or a packed mud sill, and you need to check the frame corners with smoke, the way I check my seams." Marit listened. She asked questions. She did not argue or qualify or say, "but." She listened the way a person listens when the information is urgent and the source has earned authority through results rather than credentials. She went home and hung a blanket across her sleeping area and packed a mud sill under her door and checked her frame corners with a dampened twist of straw. 3 days later, she came back to the landing and told Ragna that the north wall where her children slept was warmer at night than it had been all season. "It is not much," Marit said. But the boy stopped shivering. "Then it is enough," Ragna said. Word spread the way word spreads in small settlements, through women at the wash kettle, through men passing on the road, through children carrying observations they did not fully understand. Within a week of the storm, 3 households had sent someone to the landing to look at the shell. They came with different questions. A man named Gunder Espeland, who had built his cabin in a hurry and knew the walls leaked, wanted to know how Ragna banked the exterior. She showed him the layered technique, thin coats of mud and straw, each one frozen before the next was applied, grass pressed between layers for binding. He went home and banked the north and west walls of his cabin, the 2 that faced the prevailing wind, and reported back that his wood consumption dropped by a measurable amount within 3 days. A widow named Barbara Flatten, who lived alone and burned more wood than she could cut because her cabin was poorly oriented to the wind, asked about the inner curtain. Ragna helped her hang one. They spent an afternoon together inside Barbara's cabin, Ragna reading the smoke with damp straw and finding 4 draft points that Barbara had never noticed, because you cannot feel a small draft in a cold room. You can only see it in the behavior of smoke. Peter's eldest son came down to study the vent system. He was building a smokehouse behind the family cabin and wanted to understand how Ragna managed the draw in high wind without the smoke reversing. Ragna showed him the clay hood, the pipe angle, the gap at the collar. He took notes on a piece of bark with a charcoal stub and did not mention that his father had once called the shell a barrel. Not everyone came. Birgit did not come. Birgit's household maintained its public position that the storm had been unusual. The shell had been lucky, and the girl was still living in a piece of river junk that no respectable person would enter voluntarily. But Birgit sent her nephew, the same nephew who had stolen Ragna's dry boards. He came down the bluff path with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the ground, and he stood near the furnace opening and watched Ragna demonstrate the firebanking technique to Gunder Espeland, and he watched for 20 minutes without speaking. Then he left. Ragna said nothing about the stolen boards. The information was more important than the grudge. Niels had not come down from the ferry road since the morning after the storm, when he had climbed back up the bluff path with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who was measuring every step against the capacity of his damaged leg to bear it. Ragna went to him on the 5th day. She had not gone sooner because the post-storm work, repairing banking, restocking fuel, receiving visitors, had consumed every hour. But the absence nagged at her the way a loose rivet nagged at a boiler hand. Something was wrong in a place she could not see. His shack was worse than she had imagined. She had never visited it before. She had assumed, without thinking carefully about the assumption, that a man who understood river machinery and heat management would live in a space that reflected that understanding. Instead, she found a board shanty with gaps in the walls wide enough to put a finger through, a stove that was cracked along the firebox and leaked smoke from 3 seams, and a bed that was a plank shelf with a single blanket and a coat folded for a pillow. Niels was in the bed. His bad leg was elevated on a rolled canvas, and the knee was swollen to twice its normal size, the skin stretched tight and shining. The fall on the bluff path during the storm, the fall he had taken coming to warn Ragna about Peder, had done something to the joint that rest and cold compresses were not fixing. "You should have told me," Ragna said. "You were busy keeping people alive. I was busy keeping myself still." He shifted on the plank and winced. The knee was already bad. Now it is worse. That is the extent of the medical report. "Can you walk?" "I can stand. I can manage short distances with the stick. I cannot manage the bluff path until the swelling comes down, and the swelling will not come down until I stop standing on it, and I will not stop standing on it until the fire is tended, and the fire will not tend itself." He looked at her. "That is the circle I am in." Ragna looked at his stove, at the gaps in his walls, at the single blanket. She felt something clench in her chest that was neither grief nor anger, but a compound of both. The recognition that the man who had taught her to survive had not applied his own knowledge to his own shelter, because he had stopped believing his own survival was worth the effort. "You taught me to read smoke," she said. "Your walls are smoking in 6 places." 7, I counted last week." "Then why did you not seal them?" Niels was quiet for a moment. "Because a man with 1 working leg and no one to carry mud does not seal walls in November. He waits for spring, or he waits for something else." Ragna heard what he was not saying. She heard it the way she heard draft through a wall, not the sound itself, but the absence it created. "I am going to seal your walls," she said. "And then I am going to fix your stove. And then you are going to come down to the landing and stay in the shell until your leg can bear weight, because that shack is going to kill you faster than the storm." I did not ask for... My father did not ask for the second scalding either. Asking is not the relevant part. Niels looked at her for a long time. She could see him calculating not the logistics, which were straightforward, but the cost to his pride. A man who had spent 9 years on river steamers, who had taught a child to read smoke and manage fire, was being told by that same child that his own house was killing him. The calculation took time. "Bring the mud," he said, "and bring the damp straw. I want to see you read the smoke on a wall that has 7 leaks, not 7 patches." She spent 2 days on his shack. She sealed 5 of the 7 gaps. 2 were structural, where the board frame had twisted beyond what clay could fix. She rebuilt the stove's firebox seal with clay and ash. She hung a blanket partition across his sleeping area and banked the north wall with mud and straw in the same layered technique she had used on the shell. When she was done, the air inside was still. Not warm, because the shack was not the shell and never would be, but still. No draft. No movement. Niels sat in his chair and held a damp straw near the wall and watched it hang motionless and nodded once. "Adequate," he said. She helped him down to the landing the following week, when the swelling had receded enough for the bluff path. He stayed in the shell for 4 days, sleeping on the platform behind the curtain, while Ragna slept on a pallet near the furnace end. They shared the fire duty. They shared the vent clearing. They argued about whether the draft door needed a larger gap at the bottom for combustion air. He said yes. She said no. They compromised on a finger width increase. And the argument was the first time since his fall that Niels sounded like himself. He went back to his shack when his leg allowed it. But after that, he came to the landing every day the weather permitted, and the visits were different now. Before the storm, he had been teacher. After the storm, he was partner. The hierarchy had flattened in the blizzard, and neither of them pretended it had not. The winter deepened, and the shell became something none of them had named. It was not a house. Ragna never called it a house. It was not a cabin or a dwelling or a home. It was a heated iron cylinder banked with mud and straw, fitted with a vent and a curtain, and a fire that burned small and steady. And it sat on the frozen Missouri River landing like an answer to a question nobody had thought to ask. But people came to it now, not just to learn the technique, to use the space. Barbro Flaten, the widow, came during the second December storm, when her own cabin's draft overwhelmed the improvements Ragna had helped her make. She spent 2 nights in the shell and went home when the wind died. She brought a sack of dried beans as payment, which Ragna accepted because the beans were needed, and because refusing them would have turned help into charity, which was a different thing. Gunder Espeland's mother, who was 70 and had lungs that wheezed in cold air, spent 3 afternoons inside the shell during the worst of the mid-December freeze, warming herself by the fire while Ragna worked outside. The old woman did not ask permission. She simply appeared at the furnace opening, crawled inside, and sat against the warm iron wall with her eyes closed and her breathing steady. Ragna let her be. The shell was large enough for that kindness. 2 children from a household at the far end of the bluff, Ragna did not know their parents well, came down during a cold snap when their family's wood ran out for 18 hours while their father was away cutting. They sat inside the shell and ate the porridge Ragna made and did not understand that what they were sitting inside was the thing their parents had called a kettle and laughed about. Niels watched this and said something Ragna kept. "A boiler is built to hold pressure. You have made it hold something else." She did not ask what he meant. She knew. In late December, a boy died, not in the settlement. At a homestead 4 miles south, a family's sod dugout collapsed under the weight of drifted snow. The father dug out. The mother dug out. The youngest child, a boy of 6, was found under a beam. He had been dead before they reached him. The news reached the bluff 2 days later, carried by a man on snowshoes who was heading north to Fort Pierre for supplies. He told the story at Peder's cabin, and Peder told the settlement, and the settlement received it the way frontier settlements received such news, with silence, and practical questions about the structural failure, and the private recognition that it could have been any of them. Ragna heard it from Christy, who had heard it from her mother. She sat in the shell that evening and thought about a boy she had never met, dead under a roof that was supposed to protect him. And she thought about the iron walls around her that had not collapsed and would not collapse, because iron does not sag under snow the way sod and timber do. She thought about Peder's arithmetic. He had counted wood and walls. He had not counted the wind. He had also not counted the weight of the sky on a flat roof, or the speed at which a hot fire in a poorly vented space depletes oxygen, or the way a cracked chinking seam turns a cabin into a wind tunnel at 2 in the morning. He had counted the things he could see and missed the things he could not, and that was not stupidity. That was the limit of conventional thinking applied to unconventional conditions. The boy's death changed something in the settlement's posture. Not immediately. Not with a speech or a decision. But the arguments about the shell stopped. The mockery at the wash kettle dried up. People stopped calling it a kettle and started calling it the shell, or the iron, or, in the case of Gunder Espeland's mother, the place where my lungs work. Birgit Lunde said nothing at all for 3 days after the news, which was the longest silence anyone could remember from her. The secondary crisis came in February, and it came from below rather than above. The winter of 1880 to 81 had been brutal in its constancy. Storm after storm, cold snap after cold snap, the temperature rarely climbing above freezing from November through February. The river had frozen thick and solid, and the ice had been reliable, a white road that people had begun to trust the way they trusted the ground. But February brought a false thaw. 3 days of temperatures above freezing, not warm, but warm enough to soften the surface ice, warm enough to send meltwater running along the bluff face, warm enough to remind the river that it was a river and not a road. Then the temperature dropped again, hard and fast, and the river refroze with the meltwater still running, and the ice buckled and shifted and cracked with sounds like cannon fire that echoed off the bluffs and made the cattle bellow in their pens. The landing flooded, not dramatically, not a wall of water, a slow, grinding intrusion of ice melt and slush that came up through the frozen mud and the packed snow and the ground itself, rising an inch at a time, finding the lowest point on the landing and filling it the way water fills a bowl. The lowest point on the landing was the base of the boiler shell. Ragnar woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of water moving beneath the platform, not river loud, quiet, insistent, the sound of something that has found a way in and is not going to stop. She rolled off the platform, and her feet hit 2 inches of water that was cold enough to stop her breath. The banking at the base of the shell, which had held against wind and snow and everything the sky had thrown, was saturated. The mud was dissolving. The straw binding was pulling apart. Water was wicking up the exterior and finding the seam she had sealed with clay, and clay and water are not allies. She was out of the furnace opening in seconds, barefoot in slush, the cold climbing her legs like something alive. The landing was a shallow lake of gray water and broken ice, and more was coming. She could see it seeping from the riverbank in slow, steady pulses. The shell was not going to float away. It weighed more than anything on the landing. But if the water continued to rise, it would fill the interior, soak the bedding, kill the fire, and turn her windproof shelter into a cold iron trough full of river water. Everything she had built would be ruined, not by the enemy she had prepared for, but by the one she had not. She needed to move the shell. She could not move the shell. It weighed more than a wagon. It was half buried in mud. A team of horses could not have dragged it without chains and a clear path, and she had neither horses nor chains nor a path through the flooding landing. She could not move the shell, but she could raise it. The idea came the way her ideas always came, not as a flash, but as a memory. Her father, explaining why steamboat boilers sat on cribbing and cradles instead of bare decking. The weight needed support. The support needed to be above the waterline. If you could not drain the water, you raised the thing you were protecting above it. She needed timbers. She needed labor. She needed both before the water reached the fire. She ran up the bluff path barefoot in the dark, and she did not feel the cold because the cold was no longer the enemy. The water was the enemy, and the water was rising and the clock was ticking again. Peter answered his door holding a candle and wearing an expression that had not fully woken up. Behind him, Beret was sitting up in bed, alert the way sick people are alert, tuned to sounds that healthy people sleep through. "The landing is flooding," Ragna said. "The shell will be underwater by morning if I do not raise it onto cribbing. I need timbers and I need help carrying them." Peter looked at her bare feet, at the slush on her legs, at her face, which she imagined looked the way faces look when the thing you built is being taken from you by an enemy that comes up from the ground instead of down from the sky. "How many timbers?" Peter said. "6, heavy ones, long enough to cross under the shell, and hands to lever it up while the timbers go in." Peter was quiet for 2 breaths. Then he set the candle down and reached for his boots. "Tolef," he said to the darkness of the cabin, "get up, bring the iron bar from the shed." They gathered 5 men in 20 minutes. Peter, Tolef, Gundr Espeland, Gundr's brother-in-law, and a man Ragna, knew only as the one who lived at the end of the road and rarely spoke to anyone. They came with bars, timbers, rope, and the grim efficiency of people who understood that flood water does not negotiate. By the time they reached the landing, the water was 4 inches deep inside the shell. The fire was out. The bedding was soaked. The clay banking at the base was crumbling into gray soup. Ragna directed the operation. She did not ask permission to direct it. She did not frame it as a suggestion. She told Peter where to position the levers, told Gundr where to set the first timber, told Tolef to dig clearance under the shell's lowest point so the cribbing could pass beneath. "The priority is the base, not the top," she said. "If we lift it 6 inches and get timbers underneath, the water can pass below without touching the interior. The banking can be rebuilt after the water drops. The fire can be relit after the floor dries, but only if the floor is above the waterline." She heard Neil's in her own voice. Not the words, which were hers, but the structure, the diagnostic logic that identified the first problem and solved it before moving to the second. Airflow before fire, water before heat, sequence before force. They levered. The shell was heavy, heavier than Ragna had estimated, and the frozen mud beneath it had bonded to the iron in a grip that resisted the first 3 attempts. Gundr's bar slipped and struck the shell with a clang that echoed across the flooded landing. Tolef's timber cracked. They repositioned, dug deeper, and levered again. On the 4th attempt, the shell shifted, 1 inch, then 2. Then enough for Peter to slide the first timber beneath the leading edge. They worked for 3 hours in water and dark. By the time the gray February dawn arrived, the shell sat on 6 heavy timbers arranged in a crib pattern, raised 8 inches above the flooding. Water ran freely beneath it. The interior was wet but draining. The furnace opening was clear. Ragna climbed inside and assessed the damage. The sleeping platform was soaked. The inner curtain was wet at the bottom. The fire footing stones had shifted but not scattered. The vent pipe was intact. The seams, she checked every one with her fingers in the dim light, were damaged at the base but holding above the new water line. Salvageable. All of it salvageable. The fire could be rebuilt. The banking could be repacked. The bedding could be dried. The shell was not destroyed. The water had tried to take it, and the water had failed because 5 men and a girl had refused to let it. Peter stood outside, mud to his thighs, breath smoking in the cold dawn. He looked at the raised shell and at Ragna standing in the furnace opening, wet and shaking, and already calculating the repair sequence. And he said something that Ragna understood was the closest Peter Moen would ever come to admiration. "You prioritize the base, not the fire. The base. The fire comes back. The structure does not." He nodded. Slowly. the nod of a man adding a new line to a ledger he had been keeping for months. The flood receded within 2 days. The false thaw passed. The cold returned. Ragna rebuilt the banking, relit the fire, dried the bedding, and returned to the routine she had built over 4 months of winter. But the routine had changed. The shell was no longer just hers. During the flood crisis, 3 families had watched a 13-year-old girl organize the rescue of a piece of river wreckage with more tactical clarity than any adult in the settlement had shown during the December blizzard. That image did not fade. It settled into the settlement's understanding of Ragna Breka the way sediment settles into a river bend, slowly, permanently changing the shape of the channel. People came to her now, not as visitors, as students. A family from a claim 2 miles north arrived in late February, having heard from Gunder Espeland about the banking technique. They had lost a wall to frost heave and wanted to know how to seal the gap without tearing the wall down and rebuilding. Ragna walked to their claim, read the smoke with damp straw, found the draft path, and showed them how to bank the exterior and hang an interior curtain. A man from the Fort Road who repaired wagons asked her about the vent system. He was building a warming shed for travelers and wanted a chimney that would draw in wind without reversing. She drew the design in the mud with a stick and explained the pipe angle, and the clay hood, and the collar gap, and the man copied the drawing onto a piece of hide and took it home. Pater's son came back 3 more times. He was building the smokehouse into a dual-purpose structure, smoking meat in good weather, warming people in bad, and every visit produced a new question about draft control, fire management, or insulation technique. Ragna answered every question. She answered them with the patient specificity of a person who has tested every answer against a Dakota blizzard and knows which ones survive. And Birgit Lunde's father fell ill. He was 71. He had been a strong man once, a farmer, a builder, a voice in the elder council that Pater respected. Now he was thin, his lungs were bad, and the cold that had retreated from the other households was winning against his. Birgit did not come to the landing. She sent her nephew, the board thief, who stood at the furnace opening with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the ground, and said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, that his aunt wanted to know whether her father could sit by the shell fire for a few hours in the afternoon when the cold was worst. Ragna looked at the nephew. She thought about 2 stolen boards and a woman who had said, "When frost takes you." She thought about a sewing chest and a laundry debt, and the particular cruelty of someone who benefits from your failure and calls it arithmetic. "Bring him down at noon," she said. "I will have the fire ready." The nephew left. Birgit's father came the next day, supported by the nephew on one side and a walking stick on the other. He was a large man made small by age and cold, and he moved with the careful precision of someone who knows that falling down might mean not getting up. Ragna helped him through the furnace opening. She seated him against the warm curve of iron near the fire, wrapped his feet in dry cloth, and gave him a cup of hot water because she had nothing else to give. He sat for 3 hours. He did not speak much. He breathed. The air was still and warm, and his lungs took what they needed from it, and when the nephew came to take him home, the color in his face had changed from gray to something that was not quite pink, but was no longer the color of approaching death. He came every day for 2 weeks. Ragna tended the fire. The nephew carried him down and carried him back up. Birgit was never present, but the arrangement existed, and it existed because Birgit had asked for it, and asking was the one thing Birgit Lunde had sworn she would never do. Niels died on the 23rd of March. The river ice had begun to crack and shift, and the sound of it carried up the bluff like a long, slow exhalation, the land remembering that it was allowed to move. He had been failing since the storm. The leg was the visible problem, but the invisible problem was his lungs, which had been weakened by 9 years of boiler room air and 7 years of living in a drafty shack and one December night spent crawling through a blizzard on a path he should never have attempted. The cold had gotten into him the way cold gets into iron, not on the surface, where it can be warmed away, but deep in the structure, where it changes things that do not change back. Ragna had been visiting him every second day, bringing hot food from the shell and checking his walls and tending his fire the way he had taught her to tend hers. She sealed his stove twice more as the winter wore on, and she built him a proper sleeping platform raised off the floor, and she hung a second curtain that divided his shack into a warming chamber and a storage space. He let her do all of this without protest, which was how she knew he was dying. The Niels who had dragged her from a smoking shell by her ankles, who had told her the draw was blocked at the turn, who had said adequate, as if the word cost him money, that Niels would have argued. The Niels who lay on his platform and watched her work with quiet eyes was a man who had moved past argument into something else. 3 days before he died, he made her explain the whole system back to him, not the shell specifically, the principles. "Tell me why the shape matters," he said, "because curved surfaces deflect wind instead of catching it. A flat wall takes the force. A curved wall turns it. Tell me why the banking matters. Because iron conducts cold as well as heat. Without the exterior insulation, the shell would drain warmth to the outside air as fast as the fire puts it in. Tell me why the fire stays small. Because a small fire lasts. A hot fire burns through fuel and leaves you with nothing. The iron holds warmth from coals longer than it holds warmth from flame, and the wind cannot reach the coals to cool them. Tell me why you vent. Because trapped moisture kills bedding and lungs. A brief cold exchange is cheaper than wet wool in January." He nodded at each answer, not checking her, testing her, making sure the knowledge was built into her the way rivets were built into the shell, permanently, structurally, beyond the reach of forgetting. "Your father would have said the same things," Niels said. "He would have said them differently because he was a different man, but the knowing would have been the same." That was the last thing Niels taught her. Not a technique, a lineage. He died in his sleep on a night when the temperature was still below freezing, but the wind had dropped to nothing, and Ragna found him in the morning with his hands folded on his chest and his face settled into an expression that looked, if she was honest, like a man who had finally stopped working. She sat with him for an hour. She did not cry. She had decided not to cry in October, and she had not changed her mind, but she sat with him and listened to the silence his absence made. And the silence was louder than any draft she had ever sealed. She buried him beside the ferry road when the ground softened enough to dig. Pater helped. Tollef helped. 3 other men from the settlement helped, which was more than the attendance Niels would have expected in life, and exactly the attendance he deserved. There was no stone because there was no stone to spare, but Ragana drove a piece of iron pipe into the ground at the head of the grave, a pipe section from the same freight debris that had provided the shell's vent, and it stood above the mud like a marker that only a boiler hand's daughter would think to place. The settlement did not observe a mourning period for Niels' fight. He had not been theirs to mourn, but Ragna observed her own, which consisted of 2 days of silence and then a return to work, because Niels had taught her that the fire does not tend itself, and the work does not stop for grief. She sat in the shell on the evening of the 2nd day, alone for the first time since the December storm, and listened to the fire breathe and the iron tick as it cooled and warmed and cooled again. The river ice was groaning below the landing, beginning the long process of breaking apart. Spring was coming. The killing season was ending. She had survived. Not comfortably, not gracefully, not without cost, but survived. A 13-year-old girl exiled to a frozen landing with $11 and a flour sack had built a shelter from a piece of river wreckage and lived through the worst winter in a decade. She had done it with inherited knowledge, borrowed tools, stubborn hands, and the help of a lame man who had seen in her the echo of a dead boiler hand he had once known on the river. The fire breathed, the iron held, and outside, very faintly, the river began to move again. Spring came to the Missouri the way debt comes to a poor household, slowly at first, then all at once, and with consequences nobody had fully prepared for. The ice broke in the second week of April. Not a quiet dissolution, but a violent splitting that sent slabs the size of cabin floors grinding downstream, stacking against the bank, climbing over each other in a chaos of white and gray that sounded like a building being torn apart from inside. The landing shook. The cribbing beneath the shell groaned as the ground shifted, and for 2 hours Ragna sat inside with her hand on the iron wall, feeling the vibrations travel through the metal and wondering whether the river had decided to take back the thing it had discarded. It did not. The cribbing held. The timbers Petter and his men had placed in February absorbed the shifting ground without cracking. The shell sat above the ice melt, in the mud, and the chaos of breakup like something that had decided it belonged where it was and would not be moved by water or weather or the opinion of anyone who thought otherwise. The settlement emerged from winter the way animals emerge from a hard season, thinner, quieter, and changed in ways that would take months to fully understand. 3 households had burned through their entire wood reserves and were cutting green cottonwood that smoked badly and gave poor heat. 2 families had lost livestock. Embret Haugen, the bachelor with the frostbitten feet, had been taken north to Fort Pierre by a freighter in January and had not returned. Birgit's youngest child still coughed, though less, and the cough had the settled quality of something that intended to stay. Ragna counted the costs the way she counted everything, precisely, without sentiment, recording what the winter had taken so she could calculate what the next winter would require. The shell needed work. The banking had been rebuilt after the flood but was crumbling now as the spring thaw turned packed mud into soup. The fire footing stones needed resetting. The vent pipe had developed a rust hole near the collar that would widen with each rain. The sleeping platform needed new planks. The soaked boards from the flood had warped and would not lie flat. She made a list. She worked through the list the way she had worked through every list since October, one task at a time, in order of urgency, without waiting for anyone to tell her to begin. But the settlement was watching now. Not with mockery. Not with the clinical assessment Petter had brought in October. With something else. With the recognition that the girl on the landing had built something that worked, and that what she had built contained principles that could be taught, and that the principles mattered more than the iron. By May, the shell had become the settlement's answer to a question it had not known how to ask. The question was not, how do we survive winter? The settlement had survived winters before Ragna, and it would survive winters after her. The question was, how do we stop the wind from owning our houses? And the answer, curved surfaces, tight seals, small heated spaces, controlled venting, banked insulation, had come from a 13-year-old girl working with a dead man's knowledge inside a piece of river wreckage. Petter convened the first planning meeting for the following winter in late May, which was earlier than anyone had ever started winter preparation. He held it at his cabin, which was the traditional meeting place, but he asked Ragna to attend, which was not traditional at all. A girl, unmarried, unclaimed, 14 now by the calendar, sitting in the elder council was the kind of irregularity that would have made Birgit Lunde's jaw tighten 6 months earlier. Birgit was not at the meeting. Her husband's brother was, and he sat in the corner and said nothing and watched Ragna with an expression that contained no hostility but also no warmth. He was calculating. Birgit's family always calculated. Ragna spoke when Peter asked her to. She described the principles in plain language, the difference between heating air and heating a surface that holds warmth, the importance of sealing drafts before increasing fire, the technique of reading smoke to find leaks invisible to the eye, The value of smaller sleeping spaces within larger structures, the function of brief venting to clear moisture. She did not lecture. She demonstrated. She had brought a candle stub and a twist of damp straw, and she walked the inside of Pater's cabin the way she had walked the inside of the shell, holding the straw near every seam, every corner, every joint. The smoke from the straw revealed 3 active draft points that Pater had not sealed, 2 at floor level where the foundation logs met the ground sill, and 1 at the chimney collar where the stovepipe passed through the roof. Pater watched the smoke. So did every man in the room. The smoke did not argue. It did not assert authority. It went where the air went, and the air went where the gaps were, and the gaps were where Pater's best efforts had failed because he had been sealing what he could see instead of what he could measure. That gap at the chimney collar, Pater said. I've packed it twice. Pack it from outside, not inside, Ragna said. From inside, you push material into the gap. From outside, you push material against the gap. The wind pressure holds the seal instead of pushing it loose. Pater looked at her. The look lasted 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, something completed itself, a transfer of authority that had been happening in increments since December. The man who had counted wood and walls and found the girl wanting was now sitting in his own cabin being told how to seal his own chimney by the same girl. And the information was correct, and he knew it was correct, and there was nothing in his experience that had prepared him for the particular discomfort of learning from someone he had discarded. Show me, he said. She showed him. She showed all of them. She climbed onto Pater's roof in May sunlight and packed the chimney collar from the outside with clay and ash and a plug of wool scraps, and the draft at the collar stopped, and the stove drew cleaner, and Pater said nothing because the chimney was saying everything. Summer passed. The river ran full and brown. Ragna worked on the shell, not emergency repairs now, but improvements. She lined the fire footing with a layer of clay brick she had made herself, mixing river clay and ash and drying the bricks in the sun. She built a clay-topped bench outside the furnace opening where heated stones could be placed, creating a warming seat that the old and the cold could use without entering the shell itself. She replaced the vent pipe with a longer section, hammered from salvaged sheet iron, that rose higher above the shell peak and drew better in all wind conditions. She fitted a removable wooden platform inside the shell that could be pulled out for drying after wet weather. Each improvement was small. Together they changed the shell from a survival space into something more deliberate, not a house. Still, not a house, but a structure with design intelligence behind it, a place where every surface, every opening, every seal existed for a reason that could be explained and replicated. Niels would have called it adequate. Ragna called it nothing. She did not name her work. She just did more of it. The teaching continued through summer. She showed a family from 2 claims north how to build a wind baffle, a curved earthen wall on the windward side of their cabin that deflected the prevailing gust before it hit the structure. She showed a man from the Fort Road how to create a heat bench inside his warming shed, banking hot stones into a clay platform that radiated warmth for hours after the fire died. She showed Marit how to double curtain her sleeping area with an air gap between the layers, trapping still air as insulation the way the shell's banking trapped still earth. None of these people moved into boiler shells. That was not the point. The point was the principle. The wind is the enemy, not the cold. Stop the wind first, then the fire you have is enough. Ragna said this once to Pater, and Pater repeated it to the elder council, and by autumn it had become a phrase people used without knowing where it came from. Stop the wind first. It sounded like frontier common sense. It had not been common at all until a girl tested it inside an iron cylinder and proved it with her body. Birgit Lunde asked for help on a Tuesday in September. She did not send the nephew. She did not send her husband or her husband's brother. She came herself in the middle of the afternoon, walking down the bluff path with her skirt held above the mud and her face set in an expression that Ragnar recognized as the face of a person doing something that cost them more than money. Ragnar was outside the shell, working on the heat bench, when she heard the footsteps. She looked up and saw Birgit and did not speak. She waited. Birgit had come to her. Birgit would have to begin. Birgit stood 6 feet away and looked at the shell and the bench and the improved banking and the vent pipe and the stacked firewood and the drainage channel and every other evidence of competence that the landing presented. She looked at all of it, and then she looked at Ragnar, and what passed between them was not forgiveness and not reconciliation, but something harder and more honest than either. "I need to line a corner of my storeroom," Birgit said, "for the children, for winter. The youngest still coughs and the room is too large to heat and the corners freeze." She paused. Each word after this was more expensive than the last. "I do not know how to do what you do. I am asking you to show me." She said it in front of no one. The bluff was empty. The landing was empty. No witnesses except the river and the iron and a girl who had been told 10 months ago that Frost would take her and they would not answer for it. Ragnar could have said no. She could have quoted Birgit's own words back to her. "When Frost takes you, desperation makes people invent witchcraft out of junk. She means to winter in a kettle." She could have made Birgit feel the weight of every dismissal, every stolen board, every quiet calculation about the sewing chest and the laundry debt. She did not. "Bring me to your storeroom," Ragnar said. "I will need a candle and damp straw." They walked up the bluff path together. They did not walk side by side because the path was too narrow, and Ragnar went first because she was the one who knew where they were going, even though Birgit was the one who lived there. That arrangement said everything that needed saying. Ragnar spent 3 hours in Birgit's storeroom. She read the smoke. She found 5 draft points. She showed Birgit how to seal them with clay and cloth. She helped Birgit hang a curtain that divided the storeroom corner into a small warming space with a stove opening on one side and sealed walls on the other 3. She showed her how to bank the exterior of the corner with mud and straw in thin layers, and how to check the seal with smoke after each freeze-thaw cycle. Birgit watched everything. She asked questions, practical ones, stripped of opinion, focused entirely on technique. She was not a stupid woman. She was a proud woman learning something from someone she had tried to destroy, and the effort of keeping her voice level and her questions respectful was visible in the tendons of her neck and the stillness of her hands. When Ragnar finished, Birgit said, "What do I owe you?" "Nothing. I owe you something." "Then stop calling it a kettle." Birgit's mouth opened, closed. A flush rose from her collar to her jaw. She nodded once, sharply, and went back inside her house. The door closed. Ragnar walked down the bluff path to the landing and sat on the heat bench and watched the river, which was low and slow in the September light, and she felt something settle in her chest that she did not have a word for. It was not satisfaction. It was not revenge. It was the feeling of a seam finally sealed, an old draft closed, the air going still in a place that had been cold for a long time. Arne Solheim arrived at the landing on a day in late October, a year and 2 weeks after Ragnar's exile, carrying a set of barrel staves on his shoulder and a question in his mouth that he did not ask for 3 days. He was 22, a cooper by trade and a ferry laborer by necessity, and he had come upriver from Yankton on the last freight run before winter closed the channel. He had heard about the shell, the way people heard about unusual things on the river, from boatmen who passed the landing and saw the iron cylinder sitting on its cribbing above the bank, banked and vented and occupied, looking like nothing anyone had seen before and everything that the Missouri had always been capable of producing. He came to the landing because the ferry operator had told him there was work, salvage sorting, timber repair, dock maintenance for the spring reopening. He stayed at the landing because of Ragna, though he did not say so and she did not ask. Their first conversation was about barrel staves. He was building a storage bin from salvaged wood and river oak, and the staves he had brought were white oak from a cooperage in Yankton that had gone under during the spring. Good wood, dense, tight-grained, water-resistant. He was shaping them with a draw knife on a makeshift bench near the freight platform when Ragna came up from the shell and saw the shavings curling onto the mud. "Those are quarter sawn," she said. Not a question. Her father had told her about wood grain, one of 100 small pieces of knowledge he had scattered through her childhood without knowing which one she would need. Arne looked up. He had dark hair and a jaw that looked like it had been set by someone who did not believe in curves. His hands on the draw knife were steady and precise. "You know cooperage?" "I know wood. My father worked freight." "Halvor Brecka, the boiler hand." "You knew him?" "I knew of him. Men on the river talk about the ones who die on the water. It helps them believe they will die somewhere else." Ragna almost smiled. She came closer to smiling than she had since Niels died. It was the kind of sentence Niels would have said, dry, practical, and true, in a way that did not need decoration. They talked about wood for an hour, then about iron, then about the difference between a well-seated rivet and a rivet that would fail under thermal stress. Arne knew cooperage. Ragna knew boiler work. The overlap was in the understanding of materials under pressure, how wood moves with moisture, how iron moves with heat, how both fail when the forces exceed what the structure was designed to bear. He did not speak to her as if she needed rescuing. He did not speak to her as if her knowledge was surprising for a girl. He spoke to her the way one craftsperson speaks to another, with professional respect and the assumption of shared competence. Over the following weeks, they worked near each other. Not together exactly. He built his storage bins and repaired dock fittings. She improved the shell and prepared for the second winter. But their work overlapped at the edges, and in those overlaps the conversations continued. He helped her build a timber cradle under the shell, a proper structure of interlocking beams that replaced the emergency cribbing from February. The cradle raised the shell 18 inches off the ground, high enough to prevent flooding, and it was engineered with the precision of a man who understood how to make wood bear weight without splitting. She showed him the shell's interior. He ducked through the furnace opening and stood bent inside the cylinder and looked at the seams and the banking and the vent system and the fire footing and the curtain, and he said, "This is better work than half the cabins I have seen between here and Yankton." "It is better work than all the cabins on this bluff," Ragna said. He looked at her. She looked back. The silence between them was not awkward. It was the silence of two people who had recognized something in each other and were deciding what to do about it. They were married the following spring in Peter Moen's cabin, with Marit Vangen standing witness and Christy, now 11, holding a candle that dripped wax on the floor. Birgit Lunde attended. She sat in the back row and said nothing and left before the bread was served. Her attendance was itself a concession that cost her something, and Ragna accepted it as such. The years that followed moved the way the river moved, with seasonal rhythm, with occasional violence, and with the slow accumulation of change that is invisible day to day and undeniable over time. Rasina and Arne built a cabin above the bluff in the second year, a proper cabin, timber-framed, chinked with clay and banked on 3 sides, with a sleeping chamber curtained off from the main room and a chimney sealed from outside the way Ragna had taught Peter. It was the tightest house in the settlement. The wind could not find a way in, but they kept the shell. They kept it because it worked, because every winter brought cold snaps that tested the cabins and broke the weak ones. And when the weak ones broke, the people inside them needed a place where the air was still. The shell became the settlement's warming room, its infirmary, its refuge for the old and the sick and the young and the desperate. Ragna maintained it the way Niels would have maintained it, checking the seams with smoke, banking the exterior each autumn, replacing the vent pipe when rust took it, keeping the fire small and steady and the air clean. Women came to deliver babies in the shell during January blizzards, because the still air and steady warmth were better for a newborn than a drafty cabin. Old men came to sit against the warm iron when their lungs tightened and the cold made breathing feel like swallowing broken glass. Children came when the schools, such as they were, closed for storms, and Ragna let them sit near the fire, and she told them about smoke and wind, and the difference between heat that stays and heat that is stolen. She taught, not in a school, in the shell and in the cabins she visited, and on the rooftops she climbed to seal chimney collars, and at the council meetings Pater continued to invite her to. She taught the principles her father had put in her hands, and Niels had put in her mind. Wind is the enemy. Stop the wind first. Small spaces, tight seals, steady fires, clean air. The rest follows. By the third winter, nearly every household in the settlement had adopted some part of her method. Inner curtains hung in a dozen cabins. Exterior banking was standard practice. 3 families had built wind baffles. 2 had constructed dedicated warming corners for the elderly. The iron tank from an abandoned freight shed upriver had been salvaged and converted into a smokehouse warming room using the same principles: banking, venting, small fire, tight seal. The spread mattered. It mattered because each household that sealed its drafts burned less fuel. Each household that burned less fuel had more reserves for the deep cold. Each household with more reserves lost fewer animals, fewer crops, fewer people to the grinding arithmetic of a winter. The effect compounded. One girl's survival became a settlement's resilience, and the settlement's resilience became the kind of knowledge that travels with people when they move, carried in memory, tested by experience, passed from hand to hand the way Ragna's father had passed it to her. Ragna's children, 2 daughters and a son, grew up knowing the shell the way other children knew barns or cellars. It was the place where their mother went when the weather turned, the place where neighbors gathered when the world outside was trying to kill them, the place where smoke was red and fires were banked and the wind was not allowed. The eldest daughter, born in the shell during a February storm, learned to seal seams before she learned to sew. The son learned to read smoke before he learned to read words. They grew up inside the knowledge the way Ragna had grown up inside her father's knowledge, absorbing it through proximity and repetition until it was as natural as breathing. Arna built a plank annex onto the shell in the 4th year, a proper entry vestibule with a door that closed and a bench along one wall. The annex meant people could enter without crawling through the furnace opening, which mattered for the old and the pregnant and the proud. The shell itself he left untouched. It was Ragna's work, and he understood that changing it would be like rewriting someone else's calculation. The settlement grew, new families arrived, the bluff road improved. A proper store opened, then a church, then a school that held classes 8 months of the year. The landing became a recognized stopping point for freight and passengers, and the shell, sitting on its cribbing above the bank, banked and vented and warm, became a landmark. Travelers who had never heard of Ragna Brekka stopped there to warm themselves and asked about the iron cylinder, and were told, with varying degrees of accuracy, that a girl had built it to survive a winter, and the winter had lost. Peter Moen died in 1889, in his cabin, in his bed, with his south wall sealed and his chimney packed from outside, and his sleeping chamber curtained the way Ragna had shown him. He died warm. That was a fact people mentioned at his burial, not because it was remarkable, but because it had not been guaranteed, and the guarantee had come from a method he had once called a barrel. Marit Vangen outlived him by 6 years. She died in her daughter Christie's home, which had the tightest seals and the best vent system in the new part of the settlement, because Christie had grown up carrying nails to an exile, and had learned by proximity to Ragna's work that the details of construction are the difference between warmth and cold, between life and death, between a house that holds and a house that fails. Birgit Lunde never became warm toward Ragna. Their relationship remained what it had been since the storeroom visit, civil, functional, stripped of pretense. Birgit used the techniques. She sealed her corners and banked her walls and hung her curtains, and her children were warmer because of it, and she never once said the word kettle again. That was her conversion. It was not dramatic. It was not a speech or a tearful reconciliation. It was the quiet, permanent adjustment of a person who had been wrong and chose to stop being wrong without ever admitting she had been. Ragna accepted this. She had learned from Niels that the quality of a seal matters more than the words spoken over it. The shell stood for 31 years. It outlasted the original settlement, which grew into a town and then shrank into a crossroads and then grew again when the railroad came through 12 miles south. It outlasted the cabins it had been measured against, which rotted and collapsed and were replaced by frame houses with milled lumber and factory stoves. It outlasted the people who had mocked it and the people who had sheltered in it and the people who had carried its principles into their own construction. It stood because iron does not rot the way wood rots. It stood because Ragna maintained it every year, rebanking each autumn, replacing the vent pipe when rust demanded it, checking the seams with damp straw, and a candle stub the way Niels had taught her. It stood because the cribbing Arne had built was sound, and the drainage channel kept the water below, and the wind that had been the enemy all along, still could not find a way in. It stood, and people used it, and the knowledge it contained traveled outward in concentric rings, from Ragna to the settlement, from the settlement to the neighboring claims, from the claims to the freight routes, from the routes to the towns that grew up along the Missouri like barnacles on a hull. Not everyone knew where the knowledge had started. Not everyone needed to. The principles were simple enough to travel without attribution. Stop the wind, seal the seams, heat the surface, vent the moisture, keep the fire small. Ragna herself grew into the kind of woman the frontier occasionally produced and rarely recognized, someone whose competence was so thorough and so quiet that it became invisible. The way a well-sealed wall becomes invisible because the absence of draft is not something a person notices until the draft returns. She built winter rooms, she built warming sheds, she built storm refuges for travelers on the Fort Road. She consulted on cabin construction for new arrivals who had the sense to ask and the humility to learn from a woman who had survived what they were about to attempt. She never charged money for the knowledge. She charged attention. If you came to learn, you learned properly, or you did not come back. She was not rich. She was not famous. She was respected in the way that useful people are respected in places where usefulness is the highest currency, steadily, practically, without ceremony. In the winter of her 63rd year, Ragna walked down to the landing on a January morning when the air was still and the cold was deep and the river was locked under ice the color of old bone. The shell sat on its cribbing the way it had sat for 3 decades, banked and vented and solid, the rivets still showing along the seams like the stitching on something that had been mended so many times the mending had become the thing itself. She put her hand on the iron wall. The metal was cold. It was always cold to the touch in winter, because iron does not pretend. But beneath the banking, beneath the sealed seams, beneath the curved surface that the wind had spent 30 years trying to penetrate and had never once breached, the memory of 10,000 small fires lived in the metal, the way memory lives in hands that have done the same work every day for a lifetime. Inside, 2 old men sat against the warm curve near the fire. An infant slept in its mother's arms on the platform. A boy of 12 was feeding the fire, small pieces, steady intervals, the way Ragna had taught his mother, who had learned it from Ragna during the winter of '84, who had passed it to the boy with the same quiet insistence that Halvor Brecke had once used to press a 7-year-old girl's palm against warm iron and cold wind and make her feel the difference. The settlement had stopped calling it the shell years ago. They called it the iron lung, which was a name that had arrived from somewhere. No one remembered where, and stuck because it was accurate. The iron breathed. The people inside it breathed, and the wind, which had killed a boy in a collapsed dugout and frozen a bachelor's feet, and driven smoke into a woman's lungs, and cracked the best chinked cabin on the bluff, could not reach the air inside. Ragna stood outside with her hand on the iron and listened to the sounds from within. The low murmur of an old man telling a story, the creak of the platform, the soft pop of green wood catching, and beneath it all the deep, steady silence that meant the air was still. That meant the draft was sealed. That meant the wind had found the wall and followed the curve and kept going, the way it had kept going every day since an October morning 30 years before, when a 13-year-old girl had stood on a frozen landing with a flour sack and $11 and noticed that the wind hit her and hit the iron, and the iron did not move. She means to winter in a kettle. The words came back the way smoke comes back through a cleared flue from a distance, carrying the smell of a different fire. Birgit's voice. October, 1880. The bluff road above, 3 men pausing with a wagon, a woman's certainty as sharp and clean as a rivet seam. She means to winter in a kettle. Inside the iron shell, the old men warmed their hands. The infant slept. The boy fed the fire small. The wind screamed across the bluff and down the bank and over the river ice and hit the curved iron wall and split and passed and kept going, and the air inside did not move. The air inside had not moved in 30 years. Ragna took her hand off the iron. The cold where her palm had been faded quickly. She turned and walked up the bluff path, and behind her the shell sat on its cribbing above the frozen Missouri, banked and vented and still, holding its heat the way a cupped hand holds water, not comfortably, not generously, but completely. The fire breathed low. No draft reached the bed.